For nearly 80 years, the world has lived under the shadow of nuclear weapons, a shadow that has shaped international politics, military strategies, and the very way nations interact with one another. The dawn of the nuclear age began in 1945, when the United States detonated the first atomic bomb in the New Mexico desert, forever altering the course of history. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki soon followed, unleashing devastation on a scale never before witnessed, and forcing the world to confront the terrifying power of these new weapons. The mere existence of these weapons has been a constant reminder of humanity's capacity for destruction, and a silent warning of the stakes involved in global conflict. As the Cold War unfolded, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear catastrophe more than once, during the Berlin crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and countless other standoffs. Each time, the threat of mutual annihilation forced adversaries to step back from the edge. Yet despite moments of extreme tension and close calls, an unspoken rule, the nuclear taboo, has kept them unused in conflict. This taboo is not a formal treaty, but a powerful norm, a shared understanding among nations that nuclear weapons are fundamentally different from all other arms. The horror witnessed in 1945 became a turning point, a lesson etched into the collective memory of humanity. Since the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, world leaders have recognized that crossing this line would not just end lives, but alter the course of history itself. The nuclear taboo has been reinforced by decades of arms control agreements, non-proliferation treaties, and diplomatic efforts to prevent the spread and use of these weapons. Breaking this taboo would mean discarding the hard-won lessons of the past and opening the door to a far more dangerous world. If Russia were to use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, it would shatter this decades-old precedent, signaling to the world that nuclear arms are no longer just tools of deterrence, but have become instruments of war once again. The consequences would be immediate and profound. The psychological shock would be global, reviving the deepest fears of annihilation that haunted the Cold War era. People everywhere would question their safety, and the sense of security that has prevailed for generations would be shattered. The world would be forced to re-examine the very rules that have governed conflict since 1945. Such an act would send shockwaves far beyond Ukraine's borders, destabilizing alliances, straining diplomatic ties, and potentially igniting a new and dangerous arms race. Nations would scramble to reassess their own security, and the fragile balance of power could quickly unravel. Countries might rush to develop or expand their own nuclear arsenals, believing that international norms and agreements can no longer protect them. The trust that underpins decades of non-proliferation efforts would be eroded, making the world a far more volatile place. The firewall that has separated conventional and nuclear war would be destroyed, turning what began as a regional conflict into a crisis with truly global implications. The risk of escalation would loom over every decision, every confrontation. The world would find itself entering a new, more dangerous era, one where the unimaginable has become possible, and where the future of humanity hangs in the balance. The significance of breaking the nuclear taboo cannot be overstated. It would mark the end of an era defined by restraint, and the beginning of a period where the threat of nuclear war is no longer just a distant nightmare, but a present and terrifying reality. To truly grasp the stakes of nuclear conflict, we must first understand the terrifying power, diversity, and complexity of the world's nuclear arsenals. These weapons are not just relics of the Cold War, they remain at the heart of global security, shaping the decisions of nations and the fears of ordinary people. Today, 9 countries possess nuclear weapons, each with unique arsenals, doctrines, and delivery systems. Nuclear arsenals are vast and varied, maintained by a handful of countries, but capable of affecting every person on Earth. The United States and Russia hold the largest stockpiles, with thousands of warheads each, while nations like China, France, the United Kingdom, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea maintain smaller but still formidable forces. Their existence is a constant reminder of humanity's capacity for both destruction and restraint. Strategic nuclear weapons are the most devastating of all. Designed to obliterate entire cities, they serve as instruments of deterrence, threatening total war on a scale never before seen in human history. These include intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, and heavy bombers, each capable of delivering warheads across continents in under an hour. In contrast, tactical nuclear weapons are smaller, intended for use on the battlefield rather than against cities. Some have yields even less than the 15 kilotons that destroyed Hiroshima, but their impact can still be catastrophic. These weapons can be delivered by short-range missiles, artillery shells, or even landmines, and are designed to target enemy troops, tanks, or infrastructure. These tactical nukes can be delivered in a variety of ways, by artillery shells, cruise missiles, or even dropped from fighter jets, making them flexible tools of war, but also dangerously accessible. Some are small enough to be transported by truck or even carried by hand, raising fears of theft or unauthorized use. The consequences of using any nuclear weapon are dire. Beyond the immediate blast and firestorm, a nuclear detonation produces intense radiation, electromagnetic pulses that can cripple electronics, and radioactive fallout that contaminates land and water for decades. Even a single tactical nuke could kill tens of thousands and render large areas uninhabitable. Yet, the distinction between tactical and strategic nuclear weapons is dangerously thin. In the chaos of war, intentions can be misread, and a small nuclear detonation could be mistaken for the opening move of a much larger attack. The risk of escalation is ever present. Any use of a nuclear weapon, no matter how limited or precise, would almost certainly be seen as a strategic attack by the nation under threat. The world would be thrust into crisis, with leaders forced to make decisions in the fog of panic and uncertainty. The risk of miscalculation or accidental escalation would skyrocket. The psychological and political shock would be immediate and overwhelming, shattering a taboo that has held for generations. The fear and uncertainty would ripple across the globe, affecting not just governments, but every community and individual. The threat of further strikes would hang over the world like a shadow. While some military planners may view tactical nukes as limited, controllable tools, the reality is far more dangerous. Their use would almost certainly unleash a chain reaction of escalation, with each side fearing the worst and preparing to respond in kind. Even a regional exchange could inject enough soot into the atmosphere to trigger a nuclear winter, disrupting agriculture and threatening billions with famine. The notion of a limited nuclear war is a perilous illusion. Once the nuclear threshold is crossed, the pressure to retaliate and escalate becomes nearly impossible to resist, and the world could quickly spiral out of control. The environmental, humanitarian, and economic consequences would be felt for generations. The first use of a nuclear weapon, no matter how small, lowers the barrier for further use. Each subsequent strike increases the risk of a full-scale nuclear exchange, pushing humanity ever closer to catastrophe. The world's nuclear arsenals are not just tools of war, they are instruments of existential risk, and their use would mark a turning point in human history. Russia's nuclear doctrine allows use if the state's existence is threatened, even by conventional means. But what exactly constitutes an existential threat is deliberately left vague by the Kremlin, creating a strategic gray zone. This ambiguity worries Western analysts, as it could justify nuclear use in a range of scenarios. The Kremlin's red lines are intentionally blurred, making it difficult for adversaries to predict what actions might provoke a nuclear response. The escalate to de-escalate strategy means Russia might use a tactical nuke to force adversaries to back down if facing defeat. Crossing these red lines, such as a direct attack on Russian territory, regime change in Moscow, or a collapse of Russian control in occupied regions, could trigger a nuclear response. Recent Kremlin rhetoric and nuclear drills are meant to deter Western support for Ukraine, and sow fear. By signaling its willingness to use nuclear weapons, Russia aims to raise the stakes and make Western leaders hesitate before escalating their involvement. If Russia's leadership felt cornered, a nuclear strike could be seen as a desperate gamble to salvage victory and intimidate the West. The geopolitical implications would be profound. Crossing the Kremlin's red lines could risk uncontrollable escalation, destabilize global security, and force NATO and other powers to confront the unthinkable. Imagine a desperate Russia, facing imminent defeat, decides to use a 10-kiloton tactical nuclear weapon. The chosen target, a major Ukrainian military hub, perhaps a command center near Kharkiv, a logistics depot in Dnipro, or a key airfield supporting Western aid. The detonation unleashes a blinding flash, vaporizing everything at ground zero. Military equipment, infrastructure, and personnel are instantly obliterated. The shockwave flattens buildings for miles, while lethal heat and radiation spread outward. Survivors near the epicenter suffer severe burns and radiation sickness. Emergency responders scramble to evacuate the wounded, but lingering radiation turns the area into a deadly wasteland, unusable by either side for years. Fallout drifts on the wind, contaminating land, water, and crops. Cities hundreds of kilometers away, perhaps even in Poland or Romania, face the threat of radioactive rain, endangering civilians far from the blast. The radioactive plume could cross into NATO countries, turning a strike on Ukraine into a crisis for the entire alliance. Mass evacuations and panic would grip the region. The immediate military gain, disrupting Ukrainian defenses, would be offset by chaos, contamination, and global outrage. Hospitals would be overwhelmed, and infrastructure crippled. The battlefield would be poisoned, and the world would be forced to confront the reality of nuclear war. International condemnation would be swift and severe. The stakes would escalate instantly, demanding a response from the West and risking a wider catastrophic conflict. The world's reaction would be immediate and overwhelming condemnation. Across continents, people would pour into the streets, their voices unified in outrage and fear. Governments would scramble to issue statements, denouncing the use of nuclear weapons and calling for restraint. The airwaves and social media would be flooded with urgent updates as the world collectively holds its breath. Emergency meetings at NATO, the G7, and the United Nations would project a rare sense of unity, with leaders standing shoulder to shoulder, warning Russia of dire consequences. The language would be forceful, the stakes made clear. The world cannot tolerate the breaking of the nuclear taboo. Yet, behind closed doors, deep divisions would emerge. Eastern NATO members, feeling the threat on their doorstep, would demand immediate and decisive action. Western European leaders, haunted by memories of past wars, would urge caution, fearing that escalation could spiral out of control and engulf the continent. China and India, both major global powers with close economic ties to Russia, would face intense international pressure to denounce Moscow's actions. Likely, they would distance themselves, issuing carefully worded statements to protect their own interests and avoid being seen as complicit. Russia would find itself more isolated than ever before, shunned by the international community both politically and economically. Its leaders would be left with few allies, as even traditional partners reconsider their support. The war in Ukraine would be reframed on the world stage, not just as a regional conflict, but as a fight to uphold the most basic rules of human conduct. The suffering of Ukrainian civilians would become a rallying cry for renewed international aid and solidarity. Any nation that continued to support Russia would risk global backlash, facing protests at home and abroad, and the threat of being cut off from international cooperation. Financial markets would panic, with stocks plunging and investors fleeing to safety. Sanctions would tighten dramatically, targeting every sector of the Russian economy, while diplomatic ties would be severed at a pace not seen in decades. Major international organizations, such as the World Bank and IMF, would suspend cooperation with Russia, and global trade agreements would be rapidly rewritten to exclude Russian interests. On the military front, NATO would raise its alert level to the highest since the Cold War, deploying additional forces to Eastern Europe and activating rapid response units. Joint military exercises would be launched across allied nations, and air defense systems would be reinforced along NATO's eastern flank. The United States and its allies would likely reposition strategic assets, including nuclear-capable bombers and submarines, as a deterrent signal to Moscow. Diplomatically, a global coalition would form to coordinate responses, with emergency summits and back-channel negotiations seeking to prevent further escalation. Humanitarian corridors would be established for Ukraine, and international aid would surge. Meanwhile, Russia's only remaining leverage would be its nuclear arsenal, a tool now proven dangerously usable, casting a long shadow over every diplomatic negotiation and military calculation. The world order would be shaken to its core, as nations everywhere confront the terrifying reality that the nuclear threshold has been crossed, and the future of global security hangs in the balance. The United States would face an agonizing choice: how to respond without triggering global catastrophe. But the burden would not fall on America alone. The entire global community would be thrust into a crisis demanding unity, resolve, and unprecedented coordination. A direct military strike on Russian forces could punish the attack, but risks rapid escalation. Allies would be forced to weigh their own involvement, with NATO and other security pacts tested as never before. Alternatively, The US could impose total economic and diplomatic isolation, launching cyber offensives and flooding Ukraine with advanced weapons. The world economy would feel the shockwaves, with energy markets, trade, and financial systems destabilized for years to come. This might be seen as weak, failing to restore deterrence. The global community would struggle with the moral and practical implications of inaction, as millions could be displaced and humanitarian crises would multiply. A third option: limit the response to sanctions and support for Ukraine, avoiding direct confrontation but risking America's credibility as a security guarantor. This could fracture alliances and embolden other nuclear states, setting a dangerous precedent. Each path carries immense risks, either of nuclear escalation or of undermining decades of non-proliferation. The long-term consequences could include a new arms race, environmental devastation, and a world where nuclear threats become routine. Allies worldwide would question U.S. resolve, potentially seeking their own nuclear arsenals. The global security architecture, painstakingly built over generations, could unravel. The world would be watching, and the decision would shape the century. The psychological toll on populations everywhere would be profound, with trust in international institutions and leaders deeply shaken. The burden of response would be unprecedented, not just for the United States, but for humanity as a whole. The choices made in these moments would echo for generations. Even without direct conflict, a Russian nuclear strike would send shockwaves through the U.S. economy and society, touching nearly every aspect of daily life. Financial markets would crash, oil and gas prices would soar, and inflation would spike, straining household budgets. Everyday essentials, food, fuel, and medicine, could become scarce or unaffordable for many Americans. Global supply chains would be disrupted, causing shortages and deepening recession fears. Delays in deliveries could leave store shelves empty, while factories might shut down, leading to job losses and economic uncertainty. Russia would likely retaliate with cyberattacks, targeting American infrastructure, power grids, banks, and communications. These attacks could disrupt everything from online banking to emergency services, leaving millions in the dark and disconnected. Americans could face blackouts, banking disruptions, and a sense of chaos far from the battlefield. Daily routines, work, school, and even basic communication could be thrown into disarray. The fear of nuclear war would return, fueling anxiety and public debate over the right response. Misinformation and panic could spread rapidly, making it harder for communities to stay calm and informed. Political leaders would be under immense pressure, with the nation gripped by existential dread. Emergency measures might be enacted, and public trust in institutions could be tested as leaders scramble to restore order. The psychological impact would be lasting, a reminder of how close the world came to disaster. Mental health crises could rise, as families and communities struggle to process the trauma and uncertainty. The scars would shape American society for years to come, influencing how communities support one another and how the nation prepares for future crises. The greatest danger is uncontrolled escalation. As tensions mount, communication between world leaders becomes strained, and trust erodes rapidly. Each side would climb the escalation ladder, with every move risking a broader nuclear exchange. Even conventional military actions could be misinterpreted as preparations for a nuclear strike. Russia might retaliate against NATO bases or infrastructure, demanding a response and pushing the crisis further. NATO forces would be placed on the highest alert, ready to respond within minutes. Both sides would engage in nuclear signaling, raising alert levels and preparing forces. Submarines would vanish beneath the waves, bombers would take to the skies, and mobile missile units would disperse to hidden locations. In this tense environment, miscalculation or technical error could trigger disaster. False alarms or cyber attacks could be mistaken for real threats, forcing leaders to make split-second decisions. The systems meant to prevent nuclear war are not infallible. Fear and confusion could lead to fatal mistakes. The pressure to act quickly might override caution, increasing the risk of accidental launches. The logic of escalation is hard to escape. Tit-for-tat strikes could spiral out of control. Each retaliatory step would make de-escalation more difficult, drawing in more countries and expanding the conflict. The world would be closer to nuclear holocaust than at any time since the Cold War. The threat of further conflict would loom over every decision, with humanity teetering on the edge of catastrophe. A nuclear strike in Ukraine would shatter global security assumptions, plunging the world into a new era of uncertainty where old rules no longer apply. Leaders would face agonizing choices: how to punish a nuclear-armed state without risking apocalypse. The threat of escalation would hang over every decision, forcing governments to weigh immediate retaliation against the risk of global annihilation. The nuclear taboo would be broken, leaving the world anxious and uncertain. Everyday life would be shadowed by fear, as people everywhere question what comes next. Nations might seek their own nuclear weapons, fueling a new arms race and undermining decades of non-proliferation. The fragile balance of power could tip, as countries scramble to protect themselves in a suddenly more dangerous world. Trust in international institutions would collapse, and rebuilding it could take generations. The credibility of global agreements would be questioned, making future cooperation even harder. Yet, in the midst of chaos, there could be a renewed push for diplomacy. The hope: such a tragedy might shock the world into new disarmament efforts, inspiring nations to come together and forge stronger safeguards against nuclear war. The fear: it could be the first step toward an unwinnable war. But the future would depend on the choices made in its aftermath, whether humanity succumbs to fear or rises to build a safer, more united world.